Morning, everybody. I'm Karen Thomas from Coastal Partnership East, as Keith said. And I really hope that that film that we just showed you, which was produced by James and our team, really gives you a flavour of the beautiful things that we have around our coast. And I know everyone in the room today really appreciates the coast that we've got. What I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about today is the coastal groups around the country, and mainly the East Anglian Coastal Group. And I also would like to talk to you a little bit about the work that we do, how our work and everything that we're doing around the coast plays into the shoreline management plans and the Environment Agency strategy you've heard about today, and also to look forward a little bit about what our coast maybe might need to do and what we need to do to create a more resilient coast for the future. So the national coastal groups, for anybody who doesn't know about them, they are around the whole of the country. They are linked to our shoreline management plan boundaries, and they've been set up at a national level. I'm currently the East Anglian Coastal Group chair, and they're made up of a range of practitioners and partners. So if you like, it's the officers who are really doing a lot of the work around the country, around England and Wales. We have other interested parties, so we have NGOs and our statutory partners at the table, and they're effectively there to make sure that we're getting consistency around the coast, that we're learning from one another, and that we can share good practice. And also a place where we try to solve some of the problems. And I think from some of the presentations you've heard earlier today, there are a lot of things that we need to address. So over in East Anglia, we have the top of our patch is Gibraltar Point, and then that extends all the way around to the Thames Barrier. So it's a very, very big frontage, and we have a whole range of shoreline management plans in there, which I'll come on to later. The role of the groups is to look at the shoreline management plans that we have, to look at the next 100 years that those policies are trying to deliver. We've recently had shoreline management plan refresh to look at the policies that are in the shoreline management plans and make sure they're fit for purpose. So the groups are consultees to the Environment Agency and DEFRA when they are doing plans and strategies like this. We are also gathering evidence, we're gathering information and data with the Anglian Coastal Monitoring Group so that we can make the best financial decisions we can based on what our coast is doing. But also we're looking at what our coast is doing, and many of us are quite surprised at what our coast is doing at the moment as well. And I think throughout this presentation, the issue of pace and acceleration is something that we need to remember, and also just about capacity and resource as well. I don't know why that's come up there again. So I know that Ivan isn't here today, and I don't know if any of you have seen Ivan's presentations, but they are absolutely brilliant, and they really bring into context the climate change challenge that we're facing, as did John's slides earlier. I just wonder if anyone in the room has got children, nieces, nephews, grandchildren. You know, they're not here. And I think for many of us that are doing this role, it's a really, really complicated job, and we are trying to pull together an awful lot of information and trying to bring it to bear, as Giles was just trying to show. Trying to get things done on the coast is actually quite difficult, and we can come on to some of the reasons why later. But in the context of climate change and climate change evidence, you know, the risk assessments that have been done nationally, ultimately, climate change on our coast is a high risk. We have a very soft eroding coast. We have a lot of challenges to deal with, our habitats, our freshwater, people. It's all happening here, but the evidence definitely shows that we have seriously high risks around our part of the coast for a number of reasons. And I'm just a bit confused because my slides are in completely the wrong order and this isn't the right presentation. So, never mind. If we could just go back to, we had some challenges earlier this morning trying to upload the presentation, so I'm just going to go back to the beginning. And I think I'm just going to leave that there. So I think what I want to say today is I wanted to talk to you about shoreline management plans and why they're quite difficult to deliver. And I wanted to show you some really great pictures of some of the things that are happening around our coast. But what I'm going to do now is try and remember my presentation and explain it to you the way that I had it in my head last night. So Where we're at the moment is we've got acceleration of erosion on our coast. Our beaches are lowering. We are seeing on most of our high tides, the water is encroaching at the base of our cliffs and our sand dunes. And what that means is that for people who are living in those locations, they are seeing quite significant impacts. In the shoreline management plans, we've just done a little bit of work around the various shoreline management plans we've got around our coast. We've got the Wash, we've got North Norfolk, we come round into Great Yarmouth and the East Suffolk and then into the Suffolk shoreline management plans. We've got about 700 kilometres of coast. And when we put that in the context of what we were hearing earlier about the Dutch coast is about 400 kilometres, there's a big coastline here that we've got to try and manage. The majority of our coast is low-lying or at coastal erosion risk, and our shoreline management plan policies are really interesting for our coast. The majority of our coast actually does have hold the line policies. They're just dotted all the way through. And in between, we have lots of no active intervention and managed realignment policies. And that's where I think for most of us, the challenge is coming with regard to how we're going to fund things and how we're going to move forward with adaptation. So where we have a no active intervention and a managed realignment policy on a floodable part of the coast, what we have are some options. We've probably got a defence there already. It's probably somewhere, if you imagine the Essex Estuaries, there's probably an earth embankment of some kind. And then depending on what it's protecting, it will be revetted, or it will have concrete, or it will have sheet piling. It depends. But many of our low-lying areas already have a defence of some kind. But the shoreline management plans don't automatically present us with funding for those things. So there's still the challenge that Giles was saying earlier about how you keep those defences resilient for the things that they're defending. And you have to find the funding from somewhere to be able to keep them even resilient, which I think we're all starting to realise means that they can overtop without breaching. But where we have managed realignment options in some of the floodable areas, we have some alternative funding solutions. We have the regional habitat creation programme approaches and natural flood management approaches. So breaching defences to create new salt marshes and to create new intertidal areas. And those are on various scales around the country. Around 45% of our policies of no active intervention and hold the line are in flood risk areas. So there are some solutions for those. However, I think where some of our biggest challenges lie is the fact that when we move into the coastal erosion sections of our coast, where we have sand dunes and low cliffs, what we're really seeing there is around 55%, maybe a bit more, of our no active intervention and managed realignment policies, which are ultimately without any solutions. We don't have an equivalent to a nature-based solution. And we don't have any compensation or insurance options for people who are affected in those locations. And some of those people are here today, and for those people at the moment we don't have solutions and we don't have answers. So in terms of our shoreline management plan policy delivery, as a coastal group and as all of the practitioners that are involved, it's actually very difficult for us to deliver anything. And if you really think about it, that means that we can't deliver a shoreline management plan for getting on for around half or a third of our coast. So that sounds a bit depressing, and obviously for people who are directly affected by erosion risk, it is really difficult for us to have some of these discussions. And what that's leading to is quite reactive situations. So ultimately what it means is that we have situations like we had in Hemsby in April this year, where we had very serious high tides and high winds coinciding, and we were able, with our contractors at the time, Balfours, we were able to go in and do an emergency rock solution. Now that rock solution was only possible because there happened to be a stockpile of 1,900 tonnes of rock that a holiday park nearby had as surplus. If we want to get rock for anything, we have at least a 9-month lead-in time. to get it. So that doesn't lend itself well to dealing with an emergency. It's okay for a capital scheme if we're planning ahead, which we are for Cromer and Munsley at the moment, but it doesn't lend itself well to an emergency. And also there are questions about whether or not we should really be using rock in an emergency. So one of the things that we're now trying to think about is if we literally only got rock now, that's our only solution that we can use on our coast to buy some time for our communities. How do we get rock? How do we stockpile it? How could we purchase some in advance so we can just use it for emergencies? But also, could we use it in an adaptation sense as well, which we can come on to? So if you lived through that event in Hemsby in March and April, you ultimately I don't think I can really express how difficult it is for people in those circumstances. To have not only had the worry the days before as that storm was building, but also to really only be in a situation where officers from the local authority or from the teams that work around the coast are coming to you and effectively saying, could you please just get out now? You have to go. You have to take your pets, your children, everything. And unlike flood risk, which is ultimately devastating. When you are away from your property, you don't know if your property is going to be there when you get back, and you don't know what is going to happen to you. So that's where we need to start to move things on. And I think it was mentioned earlier, because for every place like Hemsby or Pakefield or Thorpeness or Haysborough, who unfortunately become sort of like the poster children of erosion risk, we need to think about the fact that there's going to be another 5 or 10 of those communities that are going to start to have that level of erosion and flood risk in the future. And that's where we need to start thinking about adaptation. But one of the difficulties that we face, listening to everything we've heard this morning, is we are at that watershed moment right now. We have got this opportunity. We know that it's going to get worse. But the real challenge that we've got is that there are some people who are in the problem at the moment. They are facing the erosion and the flood risk right now, and we need to work with them. So it makes it really difficult for us to get to the point where we need to plan ahead with the planners and with the other people that were mentioned this morning, like the social scientists. So we've been really lucky and very fortunate, and we've all worked incredibly hard. The members of the East Anglian Coastal Group have been very successful in attracting some of the Flood and Coast Resilience Innovation Programme funding. And I think this is a really incredible turning point in certainly the Environment Agency supporting us to do something different. So ultimately, a £200 million scheme has been available nationally. And where we're at now is that that's been split into different pots. And between us in the region, effectively, we've attracted some 35 to 40 million pounds to really accelerate our work, not erosion, accelerate our work, to be able to take that leap forward where we can actually get on the front foot of what is really required to make a coast more resilient or a community more resilient, and to work with communities on what those solutions could be. So I did have some great slides from some of my colleagues. So I'm just going to say now, in North Norfolk, it's been mentioned already, we have the Coastwise project, looking at an SMP scale approach to adaptation on the North Norfolk coast. North Norfolk's coast cliffs are probably the highest cliffs we've got around our coast. They'll fail overnight absolutely spectacularly when there's a lot of heavy rain, not necessarily so much from coastal erosion. And when they go, everything goes with them. So that type of erosion is very different to the erosion that we might be seeing in another part of the coast where, we've got sand dunes eroding or something like that. So Coastwise, working with the East Ridings team as well, are going to be looking at a whole range of different initiatives and ultimately looking at how they can support communities on the Norfolk coast to have this conversation that we're starting to have here today about becoming more resilient and adaptive. As we move round to Great Yarmouth and North Norfolk, we have the Resilient Coast project, and that's going to be doing similar things to Coastwise. We're going to be looking at how to give communities in both projects the options that they need. So whether it's funding, new planning, whether it's looking at how we can help people to visualize what a future might look like, whether it's about relocation, whatever it is, we're going to be exploring that in both the Coastwise and the Resilient Coast projects. And then as we come on down to Southend, we have the Catchment to Coast project, and there's different challenges there, as you might expect, taking a catchment-based approach from the top of the river all the way down to the coast. That project also has the additional challenge of legacy of landfill and rubbish seawalls, and also, balancing all of that with tourism and environmental enhancement. So those are the projects, and we have a fourth one, which is Reclaim the Rain, which is led by Norfolk and Suffolk County Council. And I think when we look at those 4 projects in the round for our region, it tells us something. There were 25 projects nationally. There was 2 additional coastal transition accelerator projects. So there was 27 projects nationally that were funded, and we have 4 of them in our patch. And I think that's because it just goes to show that we have got significant climate change impacts, but we've also got a lot of innovation and collaboration going on in this part of the world. And they wouldn't have given us the funding if they didn't think it was something that we could take forward and do locally. So once we've thought about our adaptation projects, I think we then need to think about the fact that we still need to protect and defend in some places, and we need to think about what we're going to need to make that coastal transition happen. So we have examples all around our coast of fantastic projects where we are holding the line, as it's called, where we are defending the majority of people and property. We've got a large number of tidal barrier projects that have been delivered. We have tidal barrier projects like Lowestoft, and even for Great Yarmouth, the question of a tidal barrier as well. In these locations, we have large numbers of people, large numbers of property, large numbers of infrastructure. And I think that certainly some of the barrier projects really identify the fact that we can't just move everything away from the coast, because there are certain industries and there are certain things that happen only at the coast. So when we think about places like Lowestoft or Great Yarmouth or Ipswich or even Tilbury, they're there because there are ports associated with that place. You can't take ports away from the coast. And also, they're very important for our national economy, and we're in a very competitive market with other European ports to make sure that we are pretty keen. So another thing that's really challenging around these projects around the larger towns is getting private investment, and particularly in the economic climate that we're in at the moment, and Giles touched on that earlier, the rising cost of everything. If you want to do a big project at the moment and it involves concrete or steel, I think I can see Tamsin out there somewhere. The cost of everything's just gone up so much that it's really difficult to keep pace with the planning and the funding programs that we are actually in. So our current funding program is a 6-year cycle, and we go to the Environment Agency with our outline business cases to fund our schemes. But in order to attract all the private funding and the partnership funding, that can take several years to get in place, and heard from Giles this morning, some cases 10 years or maybe even 15 years. So we haven't got a system that's quick enough for what's happening on our coast at the moment. Another thing that I think is really important about looking at the hold the line frontages is the fact that we need to think about the scale of them, and we need to think about the wider outcomes that they deliver. So in Great Yarmouth at the moment, the Environment Agency moving up through the town, putting in innovative ways to manage the sheet piling so that we make the town more resilient for the future. And ultimately looking at that on a town scale, on many compartment scales, and thinking about how we can bring in developers and how we can make property more resilient in the places that are perhaps going to be harder to defend. So all in all, it's about scale. We need to go bigger. We need to draw in more people that are going to benefit from our projects so that we can attract their funding. But the bigger we go, there's a bit of a tipping point there somewhere between making it too big that it makes it hard to deliver versus attracting enough people to fund the project. And I think the other side of things as well, where we've got to hold the line, is we've actually got some great examples of nature-based solutions now as well. The Bacton sand engine on a really big scale, hugely important for the UK gas supply, that we have that sediment there in front of the Bacton Cliffs, and also for future investment as well, because our coast is a place where people want to invest in hydrogen potentially. So getting our infrastructure right, but also on a small scale, nature-based solutions make a big difference. And many of our estuary groups have got experience, and the landowner groups here, of doing small schemes that make a real difference in their place to nature and, help to create natural flood defences as well. So we've got lots of hold the line examples. We've got lots of great innovation in East Anglia. But it then comes to the adaptation side of things and how we deliver that. So ultimately, I think it's been touched on many times today, but funding is probably a really big challenge. But we can't keep going to the Environment Agency and saying, can we have some more money, please? If we really want to create a resilient place, then we have to start to think about resilience in the round. So in the round means, is this a place that has a port, and the port can only be here? Is this a place where we want to have hydrogen generation? Is this a place where people want to come on holiday? Is this a place where people come and relax? And I think somebody mentioned earlier, mental health and well-being. We are a nation of people who love to go to the coast. And I think we're probably one of the only countries where people park their cars and just stare out to sea with a flask and it just mists up. I think many of you will have that recollection from your past. We like to look out from our coast. And I think that just goes to show the value of our coast. So I think when it comes to adaptation and resilience, we kind of know that East Anglia has a lot of potential. It's the only place that you can have wind turbines on the scale that we've got them. But all their cables are coming in and out of a coast that's one of the fastest eroding coasts in Northwest Europe. And we've got gas pipelines, and we've got potential for desalination plants because we've got a water supply issue. So coastal management isn't about an engineer literally rocking up and going, you can have rock or you can't have it anymore. It's about us thinking about the planning system. And I think one of the things that we're really realizing with the innovation program funding is that, I think most projects will have planners at the heart of what they're going to be doing. And most of the people in the room that are working on those projects have already tried to reach out and get a planner. They are as rare as hen's teeth these days. So I think that was another challenge that I wanted to raise today, actually, is how do we get people to come and do this stuff? Because we are going to have some challenges around resourcing. And I think to really scale this up to the level that we want to scale it up to, it's about people, and it's about officers being able to do their jobs and have all the right skills and bringing them together and having a space to do that, whilst not necessarily constantly reacting to the issues that we've currently got right now and being able to plan forward, but also being incredibly sensitive to the fact that there are people in very difficult circumstances at the moment on our coast going into this winter that we will be working with, and that's going to be another challenge for all of us. So I feel the same way that I think John finished his speech by saying, I'm always the glass is half full. I was here last year with Rachel Hill, and I said then that I felt like this was a watershed moment. We are being given an opportunity to take a massive leap forward with these additional funding streams that we've got. But it's also at the same time that things feel like they're slowing down in other ways because of the economic situation we've got, the real challenges around capital funding. So I think probably what I wanted to say was, from the East Anglian Coastal Group's perspective, as a network of practitioners, as a network of partners, that there are not a lot of us, but we are all connected into a range of organisations and a range of partnerships and approaches. And one of the things that I wanted to do today in a minute is I'm just going to forewarn anyone here from the East Anglian Coastal Group that I might want you to stand up in a minute. I think I just wanted to reflect on some of the highlights of the work that the group have been doing over the last sort of year or so. So these are people who are coming into local authorities, into the Environment Agency, Natural England, the RSPB. Many of them are in the room. And they come to work, and it is a vocation, I think, ultimately, because I don't think a lot of people would do this work if they didn't think they could make a difference. And I think most of us have come from a background of climate change. We have studied it, we have known about it, and we are trying to do something about it. So it's a very positive place. But in the last 12 months, the East Anglian Coastal Group has done a whole range of different things. We have links into the National Coastal Group network. We have the opportunity to speak to the regional flood and coastal committees and the Environment Agency and DEFRA. So we always carry up the challenges that we face on this coast with us, whatever we are doing. The officers are gathering information through the Anglian Coastal Monitoring Programme. We've got one of the longest standing monitoring programmes in the UK in this patch. And that is telling us things. But there's more things that we need to know that we don't know yet. So I think it was Richard the other day that was telling me that perhaps there was an observation that we were getting more easterlies than we'd had in the past. And if we are getting more easterlies than we had in the past, and that is now a trend, that really does have impacts on how we manage the coast, particularly in places that are east-facing. The group has also done a lot of work around the shoreline management plans, sort of stress testing. The Environment Agency nationally has looked at the shoreline management plans around the whole coast. There's 22, we have 5. And the shoreline management plan refresh has allowed us to think about whether or not the policy we've got are right. And when we say right, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are easy to deliver, but that doesn't mean that they're the wrong policy. We've also been working on the National Erosion Risk Mapping project, and we're hoping that early next year we'll start to receive data and information from the Environment Agency about our erosion risk around our coast. And when that arrives, we'll be able to start to see what is at risk now, what's likely to be at risk in the future, and that's going to be incredibly important to feed into planning. And I think probably one of the biggest things that I've learned since being at a local authority is the importance of the local plan. And I worked at the Environment Agency for many years, and as an officer there, we didn't really necessarily know about what all the local authorities did and the planning approaches. So being in this position now where we can say collectively how important local plans will be, because we need to get adaptation and resilience and some of the challenges that we've got on our coast into the local plan, because so much of what we do or don't do in coastal management will impact on the ambitions of local communities and our local authorities as well. We've also been having the opportunity to look at NAFRA, which I think is the National Flood Risk Assessment Modelling thing. He's nodding. Yeah, thank you. So that's where we've got models already. So this is a really good example of efficiencies and sort of trying to save taxpayers' funding. Giles talked earlier about a number of models that were done for the Alden Ore, and there are models for the Deben, and there are models for the Thames, and different people do different models for different reasons. And what I think is great about that project is it's saying, well, let's get a bit of a baseline together. Let's look at all of these models. Let's put them all in one place, overlap them all, and see what they tell us. And can we be certain about something, as John showed with the meteorology modelling earlier? When several models are telling you the same thing, you can have some confidence. So you don't necessarily have to spend a lot of more money on modelling, which is a very expensive thing to do. The group's also been looking at the UNESCO work that the RSPB are doing, which we're really excited about. And I'm really pleased Adam's here, so I'm not going to say much more about that, but I didn't know Adam was going to be speaking today, so thankfully that's just saved me, Adam. But the group is really supportive of bringing more of nature and environment into the work we do, particularly as I would say historically coastal groups have maybe come from more of an engineering background. So I think it's really important that we embrace all the different skills that we need to manage our coast. And then I think I really just wanted to end with sort of like what's the forward look. So the Coastal Group do a lot of work with the local government associations, Coastal SIG, Special Interest Group as well. We are currently in a situation where we're reviewing things like the Regeneration of Seaside Towns report. Lord Basson was here a couple of years ago, I think it was 4 years ago. The report had only just been released, and it was really identifying the challenges that coastal communities face, the uniqueness of coastal communities and the challenges they face as well, because they're not the same as everywhere else. And I think it's been said before, one of the biggest challenges we face is that half of our frontage is wet. And out there, the sea doesn't bring us the benefits that you get if you were in an inland place. But I think we can do something about that on this coast because there is stuff out there now. It's not just the wet. There's wind farms and cables and infrastructure companies coming to our coast to do things. So we've got to really start to look at the economics. I think a lot of our work now will start to move towards how we value our coast. What is the value of it? Not just in flood defence terms, but actually in all of those economic, environmental and social terms. And hopefully that will help us to demonstrate to other government departments why this is important. The final thing I wanted to say is that there is currently a motion for a coastal minister, which the LGA Coastal SIG and the Coastal Group Network support. And I think having that individual oversight of our coast and perhaps treating the coast more as an interconnected thing rather than lots and lots of different local authorities, environment agency and everybody else, having that oversight and overview of our coast, that we can value it in a different way. And I think the coast is so important to us nationally as well. I think Angie is here today. We talked about this. Even if you're sat in Birmingham on a Friday night and you've got Netflix on and you're eating some chips, that internet's coming through our coast. So you're getting to watch Netflix in Birmingham because it's coming through our coast. And our ports are bringing in those fish that you're having, and our farmers are growing those potatoes. So all we want is for a coast that is probably right on the forefront of climate change challenge to really be given perhaps a bit of additional support in the short term. We are the forerunners of a lot of this, and a lot of what we learn on adaptation will go to all of the other parts of the country later on. So I just wanted to ask all of my East Anglian Coastal Group officer colleagues to stand up just for a moment, please, because there's not loads of them. They're going to be shy. Okay, thank you. And I just want you to see that there's not a lot of people trying to make a difference on your coast, but all of these people are. But hopefully you'll recognise somebody that's standing up, and you'll understand that each of these people is representing an organisation or a group that is also connected to a community, and we are trying our best. I think it's probably what I'd like to say today. So on that note, I will pause there and apologise that I didn't get to show you any of the lovely photos I was going to show you. So thank you.
Right, huge thank you to Karen, because that's the ultimate thing if somebody pinches your PowerPoint slides. So it did remarkably well, at least you brought the words. Karen, thanks ever so much. And I think that highlighted a lot of the complexities that we know about the coast, and it sets us up perfectly. We're breaking for lunch in a little while, but we've got time for a few questions. But sets up perfectly for those workshops this afternoon, and certainly carry on some of these conversations over lunch and when you visit our stands and stuff from our exhibitors as well. So as I say, we've got a few minutes before lunch, so happy to take a couple of questions. Have I, gentlemen at the back? Thanks
very much for a very good presentation. I'm Vince Langdon-Morris. I'm from East Suffolk Council. I was talking to a fisherman in Aldborough who was telling me about the removal of shingle off of the coast in licensed areas by, he stated, Dutch companies, and also chatting to CFAS recently about this. There's a blog called Marinet, and the chap that did it has unfortunately died in 2019, but it has some fabulous information about the amount of shingle being taken off, just off of our coastline, and whether you'd considered that as having an impact on these increasing erosion rates. This removal of shingle, which is apparently going to building projects all across Europe, but does that change our coastline and have an effect? Thanks.
Okay. I know that I've got some colleagues in the room who'll be able to add to this if I don't get this quite right. But all of the offshore and nearshore dredging that is done under licence. There has to be significant environmental impact assessment work done before anyone can be given a licence. The technical side of things is that most of it's done in what I would call deeper water. The North Sea is not particularly deep, but it's deeper water. And from a coastal processes perspective, most of the challenges that we face on our coast with regard to erosion and shifting beach levels and everything else is more to do with longshore and nearshore processes. We have coastal bars, we have coastal nearshore spits, and basically seasonally everything's working its way backwards and forwards on and off the coast and up and down the coast. So my understanding is that anything that is being licensed offshore is being done in a very, very, very regulated way, and they have to demonstrate if they were having any impact on the wider environment. But I'm going to look at Kelly and David Kemp from the Environment Agency, because I know we always get questions from... Is that okay? Okay, I'm getting a thumbs up that gave the right answer.
Thanks, Karen. Obviously, you can collar David Kemp and colleagues at lunchtime. Everybody knows who David is. You'll thank me for saying that. Any other questions before we break for lunch? Gentlemen, Andrew. Oh.
Karen, following on from that and looking then at nearshore sediments and the importance of warping up of the fields that was necessary to create the Wallasey Wild Coast, and thinking where that sediment comes from, and linking that to your comment on how important our local ports are, and bearing in mind the huge effect they have and the dredging they do. And whether one cannot find some way of making better use of those sediments rather than dumping them out in deeper water. I mean, the material that's been dredged out of Harwich Harbour is equivalent to the entire volume of salt marsh on the Essex coast. And one suspects that has some degree of effect in the long term of removing that sediment from the longshore drift. How can we work with the ports to get better use and more environmental sustainability by using those ports to raise the land levels, to make nature benefit solutions more reasonable and more cost effective?
Okay, so I think one of the challenges we've got with the East Coast estuary, well, all estuaries, is that they are silting up. That's what they're supposed to do. So obviously from the port's perspective, to maintain navigable channels, they've got to dredge out what's coming in from the sea. I think I'm right in saying that the majority of sediment doesn't come down the river, it is coming in from the sea. And as a result of that, what you are taking out, I mean, obviously it depends where you are. We know some ports do trickle recharge where they put it back into the water column. So the Stour and Orwell is a good example of that. But we also know that we can take those sediments and place them, as we have done on projects that we've both worked on, Andrew, on top of salt marshes and in places that are, in need of sediment. However, I think we also recognise the fundamental challenge is more to do with the mechanics. So a big dredger that is full of sediment cannot get in easily to the places that we would want to get it into, and the cost of transferring it onto smaller dredges or getting smaller dredges to do it so they can get in close to the shore obviously means that there's a cost aspect to that. And then finally, obviously, there's the challenge of taking marine sediments and placing them inside a terrestrial site, and all of the challenges of waste licensing and things like that. So I don't think anything's impossible. Nothing's impossible. It's just how much things cost. And if somebody wants to do it badly enough, then it's basically what we're doing about engineering at the moment. We're putting out calls to the industry to say, well, there's got to be something other than rock. So if we want smaller dredgers that do more efficient jobs so they can get close to the shore, the dredging industry needs to see why there's a reason for them to do that. And there isn't enough in the system yet for them to be able to go, oh, that looks exciting. Maybe we'll invent a different type of dredger. So I think that's where taking a strategic approach, a catchment-based approach to how we manage our coast, looking at these big issues and whether or not they can be addressed by perhaps completely new, innovative technology, ultimately that has to be done pretty soon if we want to get people to, it's like electric cars and everything else, if we want people to do it and adopt it, we've got to start now, haven't we? I don't think we should say no to anything until we've worked out if it's a really terrible idea.
Thanks, Karen. And final question before lunch, and you're all facing this way, and I can see lunch at the back. This gentleman.
Hi, Tim. All the way from Lewis.
When we do coastal, I hope I can articulate this question, and it was partly our conversation over coffee, briefly. We do what I call fantasy coastal engineering, where we look at all the long list options.
Yeah.
Can I pose a question? Is there a fantasy coastal adaptation management, hinterland, financial planning we should be doing, about how we really pull this together around how we finance this, because Giles was hinting at it, John definitely was hinting at it. Our model is around cost-benefit ratios, around what we're looking at in the shorter term, but our model needs to be about how do those fish and chips get delivered in Birmingham, but also how we also make sure we've got something we can manage when we've only got no time to manage it because there's those extreme sea level rises.
Yeah. I think probably as a group of practitioners, we recognise the importance of flood defence grant and aid as a piece of the pie. But I think we've grown up in a world where we did an outline business case and got mainly flood defence grant and aid, and we might get a little bit of extra top up from partnership funding, or the RFCC would be supportive or whatever. I think we've reached a point where we've got projects that are now more partnership funding than they are flood defence grant and aid. And as a result of that, the question, I suppose, is, and we know that outline business cases for flood defence grant and aid, you know, working with our consultants, are starting to cost increasingly more and more because they're becoming more and more complicated to write. Perhaps one of the things that will come out of the work that we're doing across these really important innovation projects is, do we just need a different type of business case? And do we have a business case that isn't just for one organisation anymore? Maybe we have a government business case and each department gets to have a look at how we've, you know, decided that was the bit of the pie that we were hoping to get from them. So I think that could be really important, and certainly as officers who've got limited time trying to write multiple business cases to different organisations for different pots of money that are all going at different, you know, 10 years, 3 years, 6 months time intervals. I think that's a really, really important way to be more efficient. And perhaps people will get a better business case at the other end as well, because we're sort of trying to shoehorn stuff in that just doesn't work. So yeah, I think that's an important one. And I think the other one, which you sort of alluded to, is if there's only one option, don't do a long list of options. If that's what the community want and can buy into, and it sits with the shoreline management plan policy, don't spend a year trying to tell everybody why you've gone through a long list of options. I think you just have to say, because none of them will work, and we will have to be a bit more accepting of the fact that, well, actually, yeah, they probably won't. So.
Right, thanks, Karen. Thank you for the question. If we can just thank Karen for her time. Right, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the lunchtime point. So just before you go, first things to say, back for 1:30, please. We've got Professor Graham Underwood this afternoon, and obviously we've got the workshops as well, which is building on your chance, if you haven't had a chance to ask questions, to talk through some of the issues that we've heard this morning and some of the challenges that John and others have placed before you. Please do, A, have some food, otherwise you'll faint. B, make sure that you go and see our exhibitors, and more importantly, the pledge for the coast, in the area of the coast, take time to talk to those people and think about what you're going to do for the coast going forwards. Thank you ever so much for your time and your participation this morning. Have lunch.